There is a certain shine to darkness when you look long enough, a reflective sheen like the surface of a black lake at night. And in that mirror, the world seems to whisper that what we call reality might be the image, not the object, as if the universe were a projection cast from an unseen boundary, inviting you to lean closer and ask which side of the glass you truly inhabit. Ancient minds left metaphors like breadcrumbs across the centuries. The cave where flickering shadows tempt prisoners to mistake outlines for essence. The jeweled lattice of Indra's net, where each gem reflects all others and contains the reflections within its surface. The hermetic phrase that says as above, so below, as if wisdom noticed a strange correspondence between edges and interiors, long before equations learned to speak such a language. The crisis that modern physics stumbled into did not begin with mirrors, but with darkness, so dense it turned itself into geometry. The black hole, a region where gravity folds time and space into a knot, and something peculiarly precise happens at its skin. The entropy, the measure of how many internal arrangements a thing can hide, grows not with the black hole's volume, but with the area of its horizon, a quiet fact that cleaves expectation like a blade and leaves an opening you cannot ignore. Bekenstein sensed, before the derivation was complete, that there was a bound to how much information could occupy a given region, and Hawking gave the horizon a temperature that made it hiss with faint radiation. The two together, suggesting that a black hole is not a hole at all, but a ledger, its surface inscribed in Planck scale units that count the states it can conceal, a realization that turns geometry into bookkeeping and invites the thought that all of physics might prefer to place its secrets on walls rather than in rooms. Gerard T. Hooft wrote down the audacity as a principle, and Leonard Susskind gave it teeth, proposing that the number of degrees of freedom in a spatial volume cannot exceed those encoded on its boundary, a constraint so general and unforgiving, it demands that any theory of gravity behaves like a hologram, the way a thin plate encodes a three-dimensional image in a pattern of interference. That looks like noise until light arrives and teaches your eyes how to read. In a hologram, every part of the plate contains the whole image, distributed and redundant, so that breaking it leaves fragments that still show the object, albeit with less clarity, and this too carries a hint about how the universe might archive itself, with bits spread across horizons in a way that resists loss and lurks at the edge of perception, as if the very fabric were a conspirator against erasure that expects inquiry to be both patient and sly. Imagine, then, that what you call a region of space is like the interior of a theater, while the true script is written on the curtains at its rim, and events that seem to play out within are merely the performance that a boundary script produces when lit from the right angle. A perspective shift as dizzying as it is serene, because it says the inside owes its existence to correlations stitched at the edge, and you begin to search for the seam with your fingertips. Hints of this arrangement arrive as inequalities and bounds, the Bousseau bound that corrals entropy on light sheets, the covariant notion that you should count states not on fixed spheres, but along null surfaces that move like whispers, a technical refinement that nonetheless feels like a mapmaker, changing projections to remove distortions, revealing continents that were always there, but misshapen until the right grid was laid down. If all of this remains mere rehearsal, the stage directions still point toward a performance that would be unmistakable if you could sit at the universe's balcony and see the whole proscenium, a vantage we do not have. And yet the mathematics ventures a bolder claim. There exist spacetimes where one can prove the equivalence between a gravity-filled bulk and a gravity-free boundary theory, the sort of declaration that makes you wonder whether the world is a poem that can be translated without losing its rhyme. The thought settles like evening mist. If the interior is woven from the boundary's information, then perhaps distance is a measure of entanglement, and geometry itself is what it feels like when correlations knit themselves into a shape, a sentence that sounds like sorcery, until you remember that sorcery is often the first draft of technology, and somewhere in that draft, you can just make out a door that was not there the last time you looked. The paradox that sharpened all of this into urgency began like a rumor whispered from the rim of the abyss, when Hawking showed that black holes radiate as if they were hot, featureless bodies, emitting a thermal spectrum that cares nothing for the details of what fell in, an amnesia that, if taken literally, would erase information and place quantum mechanics on a pyre, a heresy too stark to accept and too well argued to dismiss. Horizon area counts microstates, the entropy scaling with surface rather than volume, a script written in bits of Planck area, and yet the glow from the hole seems to scribble random numbers as it evaporates, a process that would leave the universe with less information than it began, offending a principle so fundamental it reads like grammar for reality, insisting that pure states evolve to pure states even when you are not watching closely. Susskind and Hooft answered with a doctrine that treats the horizon as a membrane rich with degrees of freedom, a stretched surface that absorbs and re-emits, scrambles and releases, so that to an external observer nothing ever crosses the edge, while a freely falling observer glides through with no drama, a peaceful duplication that threatened consistency until a later chorus proposed that the two stories cannot both remain gentle when quantum entanglement is policed with the zeal it deserves. The firewall argument arrived like a crack of static on a dark frequency, suggesting that if the late radiation is entangled with the early radiation, it cannot remain entangled with interior modes, and monogamy of entanglement would then force a brutal choice. Either quantum mechanics fails, or the horizon becomes a sheet of searing quanta that incinerates anything passing through, a resolution so violent it offends the clean lines one hoped geometry would keep. And yet, it clears the throat to announce a deeper structure waiting backstage. Scrambling became the word of the hour, the way a black hole mixes information so thoroughly that local disturbances are spread across all degrees of freedom in a time that scales like the logarithm of entropy, marking such objects as the fastest scramblers in nature. And when you imagine a message thrown into the hole, dissolving into correlations that are everywhere and nowhere, you begin to sense that the boundaries language is a cipher, and the bulk's column is the face a well-encrypted secret wears. The page curve, a sketch of how entanglement entropy ought to behave if information is not lost, falls and rises in a way that protects purity. And recent calculations using quantum extremal surfaces and island prescriptions have traced this curve, with a hand steady enough to convince skeptics that gravity can, under the right accounting, return what it borrowed, not by spitting out the past in recognizable chunks, but by encoding it into patterns that, in principle, a patient decipherer could learn to read. This is not erasure but steganography, with the Hawking radiation acting as a medium that hides messages in its correlations, invisible to coarse inspection and revealed only to those with an improbable P, an image that turns a black hole from a maw into a vault, the difference being perhaps more practical than philosophical. And yet the vault metaphor brings its own hints, because vaults imply locksmiths, and every lock suggests the possibility of a map. Meanwhile, complementarity refuses to fold quietly, insisting that physics might allow dual descriptions that look contradictory, while never issuing a single observer of paradox, a diplomacy that many accept with a sigh, knowing that when information is as distributed as holography suggests, questions must be phrased with care, and answers will arrive with disclaimers that sound like poetry written by cautious accountants. The sense grows that the trouble is not a bug, but a spotlight, and black holes are not pathological accidents, but laboratories where space-time reveals its accounting rules, where entanglement and geometry barter favors at the threshold, and where any final word about interiors will likely be a boundary sentence with unusual punctuation, a syntax that asks us to rethink what it means to be inside, outside, and in between. Picture a long winter night in a quiet observatory, where instruments hummed while the universe spoke in photons that left their sources millions of years ago, and imagine slipping a tiny signature into that hum, so that much later, a mind attuned to certain patterns could hear the message and smile. And somewhere in that image is the clue, The holographic world may not hide its secrets, so much as require a listener who has learned how to untangle chords from a song that at first sounded like noise. There is a family of spacetones where the holographic suggestion becomes a declaration, where gravity in a curved interior is paired with a quantum field theory on the boundary that has no gravity at all. And if that claim feels like a riddle, it is also a blueprint. The anti-de Sitter spaces whose negative curvature acts like a cosmic amphitheater, reflecting signals toward an edge that behaves less like a horizon and more like a stage's proscenium arch. Juan Maldacena's conjecture made this precise, proposing that a theory in the bulk is exactly equivalent to a conformal field theory living on the boundary, a dictionary that translates particles into operators, scattering into correlation functions, geometry into entanglement patterns. A dictionary so thick it reads like two languages that were always dialects of the same speech. And the more entries we test, the more fluent the conversation becomes. Within this duality, tangled pairs of quanta on the boundary acquire weight and shape, because the Ru-Takayanagi prescription equates the entanglement entropy of a boundary region with the area of a minimal surface in the bulk, anchored to that region's edges, a bridge that runs both ways, suggesting that increasing entanglement stitches space more tightly, while decreasing it unthreads fabric into rifts, a picture that makes you feel the loom under your feet when you walk. Tensor networks brought this into an artist's workshop, with multi-scale entanglement renormalization ansets, drawing webs that coarse-grain and refine, layers that look suspiciously like slices of curved space, toy models that capture in chalk, encode the way a boundary pattern gives rise to an interior with depth. And although these are sketches, they hint that the essence is already in the first lines, waiting for a steady hand to finish the canvas. Quantum error correction emerged as a surprise hero, showing that the way information is protected in fault-tolerant codes mirrors the way bulk data is redundantly stored across boundary regions, so that local erasures on the boundary need not doom an interior point. A resilience that explains how bulk locality can exist, even when the boundary theory has no notion of distance. A resilience that feels like the universe acknowledging that memory is a sacred duty it fulfills by design. Subregion duality and entanglement wedges define which parts of the bulk are controlled by which patches of the boundary, carving the interior into domains that answer to different custodians on the edge. And from this perspective, horizons become not absolute walls, but features of control, shifting with the set of boundary observers you allow to cooperate. A relativity of access that folds neatly into the intuition that knowledge is power when geometry is written in correlations. Einstein-Rosen bridges, the wormholes that connect distant regions, reappear as a synonym for entanglement, a line condensed into two letters, I equals EPR. That says a non-traversable tunnel is just another way to draw the bond between paired quanta, and under certain conditions, with carefully injected negative energy via quantum effects, even a whisper of traversability can be coaxed, as if the boundary learned to sing a duet that briefly opened a door for a message to cross. Couple two boundary systems with a gentle interaction, and a bulk wormhole can become passable for a signal, a laboratory-amenable recipe that took the fantasy of a portal and translated it into an inequality that you could test in principle. And recent experiments in synthetic systems have emulated aspects of this protocol, not by bending space, but by arranging entanglement, so that information travels along a circuit that plays the role of geometry, a rehearsal where the props are metaphors and the timing still matters. The boundary language remains dense, but its cadence grows familiar as you listen. Correlators here dictate distances there. Complexity on the edge mirrors interior volume. Certain growths in circuit depth correspond to the expanding throat of a wormhole. And although these identifications are provisional and partial, they point toward a new manner of thinking in which building space means cultivating entanglement, like a gardener learning that roots weave into soil as surely as branches reach for light. The air is thinner at these heights, and the stars seem sharper, and you can almost believe that a mathematician's proof could summon a bridge the way a spell might in older stories, not because the universe obeys words, but because the right words capture structures so faithfully that those structures begin to reveal new paths. And somewhere in that faith is a quiet promise that the next step will present itself if you keep your breath steady. The amphitheater of anti-de Sitter space is an accommodating stage, but our cosmos curves the other way, ballooning under dark energy so that distances grow and a horizon hides regions forever. And that difference drapes the holographic idea in a new fabric, one where the boundary may be less tangible, a cosmological screen at the limit of what any observer can ever see, challenging us to ask whether the play can still be performed when the theater walls drift outward. In flat space, symmetries at null infinity form an algebra richer than expected. The BMS group that tracks how light rays reach the far edges, and celestial holography reframes scattering as a conformal theory on the sky, transforming the momentum of particles into coordinates on a sphere that every telescope shares. A reparametrization that is part technique and part revelation, a way to file events so that their echoes line up like beads on a string. De Sitter holography is more conjecture than theorem, an attempt to pair a positively curved universe with a boundary that may live in imaginary time, or in the data of observers marooned within their own horizons. And if the dictionary remains incomplete, the compass still points toward an accounting where what you can describe is what you can gather on your personal screen, a personalization of holography that replaces a single theater with many private balconies. The thermodynamics of horizons extends to these settings, with the Sitter space wearing a temperature and an entropy proportional to the area of its horizon, a cosmic warmth so faint it is buried under cosmic microwave whispers, and yet it affirms that boundaries everywhere behave like ledgers, keeping track not with ink, but with microstates, a habit that converts the entire sky into a potential archive, quiet and reluctant to speak until the right questions are asked. Quantum complexity steps forward to explore interiors that stay out of reach, proposing that the growth of a black hole's interior volume, long after equilibrium seems achieved, mirrors the growth of the minimal number of gates needed to prepare the boundary state from a simple reference, a duality summarized as complexity equals volume, or complexity equals action, slogans that hint at a computational anatomy under the skin of spacetime, as if geometry breathes in algorithms. The SYK model, a dance of randomly coupled fermions with an emergent conformal symmetry, becomes a toy universe where many of these ideas can be tested without grief, reproducing features of maximal chaos, wormhole-like correlations, and solvable dynamics, a playground that is humble in appearance and rich in lessons, because it lets one study how order emerges from randomness and how a boundary system can manage to feel like a pocket of gravity when no mass is assigned. Edge modes in gravitational dressing remind us that in gauge theories and gravity, what looks local often depends on a choice of anchoring to a boundary, a tie that seems philosophical until you realize it is practical, prescribing how to define observables that would otherwise be gauged away. And each such construction is another thread pulled taut between the interior and the edge, a reminder that the loom's frame is part of the tapestry, not merely its support. Time itself begins to look emergent when you trace these filaments, an arrow that aligns with entanglement growth, and the forgetting encoded in coarse graining, a direction that may be born from the way patterns spread and correlations relax, so that yesterday and tomorrow are statistical features of a code rather than cosmic absolutes. A thought that does not shrink life so much as give new flavor to memory, which now resembles a boundary snapshot we perform as part of the world's computation. If this is true, then perhaps minds are small holographic devices, compressing streams of sensory data onto the screens of recall and expectation, forming models that sit at the edge of our private interiors and project worlds we can navigate. An analogy too neat to trust and too suggestive to discard, because it transforms perception into a microcosmic echo of the macrocosmic principle, and echoes often carry clues the original sound kept to itself. Across laboratories, lower dimensional gravities are coded into qubits and cold atoms. Analog experiments simulate horizons and scrambling, and the first wobbly steps toward controlled teleportation through engineered couplings have been taken with care. Each result modest and loud only to trained ears. Yet altogether, they compose a prelude, a quiet overture that leaves you with the feeling that you are learning the music well enough to anticipate a refrain before it arrives. Philosophy enters softly and asks whether a world that is holographic is less real or differently real, whether substance gives way to relation, whether being is replaced by encoding, and in that question sits an unease that is more aesthetic than practical, because equations do not flinch at such rearrangements, while human minds care deeply about whether they live in a valley or on a map, and the illusion of one can be the reality of the other if navigation is faithful. The holographic principle is not a claim that we are imprisoned in an illusion spun by a prankster civilization, not the simulation hypothesis in disguise, but rather a statement that the full bookkeeping of a region can be placed on its boundary without loss, a compression that doesn't abolish depth, but explains it. And the difference matters, because a simulation suggests arbitrary control, while a hologram suggests equivalence, a parity that restrains conspiracies even as it fertilizes them. Agency threads through this without breaking, because even if interior events are mirrored by boundary correlations, the dynamics can remain richly indeterminate from any local vantage, preserving the sensation of choice that is more than a sensation when unpredictability and contextual dependence hold sway, and in that preservation lives a kind of freedom compatible with codes, like improvisation within a mode that lets new phrases ring true without violating the key. Ancient iconography returns as a quiet companion rather than an authority, mirrors and mosaics, and star charts that mapped heaven onto temples, the mirrored patterns on cathedral floors and the vaults they echo, the sense that builders always suspected that edges matter more than they seem. And while no ancient text knew the entropy of our horizon, the urge to encode narratives in borders and lintels feels like a cultural rehearsal for a physics discovered late. The informational turn reframes ethics as well as ontology, because if information cannot be destroyed, then harm and healing both leave imprints that cannot be erased, a sober thought that makes memory a weight-bearing structure in a universe of records. And technology built on these principles, quantum networks, error-correcting architectures, entanglement harvesting, becomes not only instrument but metaphor, a mirror we hold that reflects us back with uncanny precision. Dark corridors of rumor persist, files whispered to exist in locked rooms that describe experiments merging geometry and computation, archives that are alleged to capture histories as if plucked from a cosmic boundary, claims that decline the daylight but flourish in the half-light where yearning and doubt make common cause. And while evidence remains a polite no-show, the allure lingers because a holographic world offers the perfect cover story, a tale that promises secrets stored at the edges where no one looks. More credible is the steady progress of quantum simulators, devices with hundreds of tunable elements that realize Hamiltonian's chosen like incantations, circuits where entanglement patterns are painted stroke by stroke, platforms where toy gravities breathe and release, and through them we may earn not shortcuts to omniscience, but a practical fluency in the grammar of emergence, the kind that allows a craftsman to feel when the wood is ready to bend before it creaks. Some wonder whether cosmic acceleration will render our boundary forever beyond comprehension, a horizon that recedes as we pursue, a calculus that ensures modesty, and yet the holographic lens turns that too into invitation, because it tells us that what we can know is exactly what we can encode on our own screens, and that injunction is not a limit so much as a project, a call to refine the detectors we already are until whispers sound like speech. In the quiet of night, you can imagine the universe as a library where each wall carries an inscription, and each inscription can be read two ways, once as text and once as architecture, and you can picture yourself as a reader who learns to press the letters and feel the hallways shift. And whether or not such dexterity is ever more than an image, it steals nothing from the wonder that the same story can be told as a room one walks and as a page one studies. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.